the next alderman of the 17th Ward. Luskin. I am a parent of 3 sons in the Chicago Public Schools and an organizer with the Chicago Teachers Union, where I help represent our members at schools in the Englewood-Gresham networks, so sort of in this community, many of these schools right around here. I work with both the teachers at those schools who are in the union, but also with parent organizations around the area, many of the local school councils and parents who've been active, especially where we've had some real fights, and we've had big fights on the south side around the public schools, right? Yeah. We've been pounded on these school closings. 50 schools were closed in this city, right? We had a mayor who chose, and we should be clear that this was a choice, chose to close more schools than Hurricane Katrina, right? This was the biggest school closing ever enacted by an American city. And we saw that these school closings targeted Black and Latino communities. Almost 90% of the impacted students were African American, right? And they like to throw their hands up and act as if budgets, when they talk about the budget at CPS or with the city of Chicago, as if these are things that are just a law of nature, right? It's like gravity. We're just broke. Sorry, there's nothing we could do. As if the budget was handed down from God himself and their hands are tied and their only choice is to close schools. And we've got to push back on this idea, right? Budgets are political. Budgets are a moral document. People have heard that saying, right? Budgets reflect the priorities of the people who get to make the decisions. And right now, not enough of us sitting in this room get to make those decisions, right? We would have very different budgets if we had more of a voice. And that's part of what this is about. After they closed the schools, they came back and the schools that were left standing were further devastated by another round of cuts. People might remember before the teachers' strike a couple years ago, we were talking a lot about how many schools didn't have libraries in the city, right? It was roughly 160 schools with no library or no librarian, right? Students had no access to a library in their school. And when they closed these schools, supposedly to help save resources and provide a better education to these children, and we should say, those 160 schools with no library, 150 of them were south of North Avenue, right? And when they did these school closings, you would think you would wind up with less schools that are lacking those kind of resources, right? If you believe what they're saying, they were trying to preserve resources, provide more to these children, and we saw the opposite happen. In fact, we saw another round of devastating budget cuts. I was just telling the brother in the back, I was visiting Orr High School the other day, out on the west side. Orr High School, one school that is struggling, took over a $1.2 million budget cut this past year. That's how they started the school year, on one school, right? So we've just seen it get worse. There's not a dime to spend on students, is what they tell us, but then millions to put into kind of a PR effort pitting parents and teachers against each other, right? This has been their attempt. And we need to be clear about this, that the same people who want to bust our union and cut our pay or get rid of pensions in the city, they are the same millionaires that are dedicated to not paying taxes, or if they do pay taxes, they sure as hell aren't going to let that money go to fund public education in neighborhood schools, in Black and Latino neighborhoods, and they're sure not going to let it wind up anywhere where it's under public control rather than private control. So, here's what's happening. When our schools are struggling, we get blamed. And I don't just mean the teachers, I mean communities, right? We get told that the parents aren't working hard enough. When they take over these schools and shut them down, they get rid of the local school councils and push out the most active community members, right? We're being told that we can only deserve this funding if it's under private control. They bend over backwards to fix the budget as long as it's taking from the community. When they couldn't close schools fast enough, they went down to Springfield and got a law changed to allow them to close schools even faster. They're pushing to change the laws to be able to take from retirees in the community, right? We've lost 50% of the African American teachers in this city in about a 15-year period, right? They're willing to work overtime to save resources when it's at our expense. But there's a different question, which is all of this money that's flowing out into private control, either through the TIF funds, through rip-off deals with the banks. People might have seen in the news this week, Deborah Quazzo, one of the members of the Board of Education, one of these billionaires appointed to run the Board of Ed by the mayor, right? We don't get to elect our Board of Education. Turns out, not only does she sit on that board and get to vote to close our schools, because millions of dollars that companies she's a part owner of have picked up in contracts with CPS. So she's voting to close our schools, saying they can't afford education in this community, but at the same time can afford to make her and her pals wealthy once again. And so tonight, this is what we're hoping we can do. We're going to have a little bit of a discussion about what we need. What are the resource needs at our schools? We're going to have a presentation from Mr. Tresser about the TIF programs and understand where some of the resources in the city are going and how little control and transparency there's been over some of that. And then lastly, we're going to try to wrap up the night with a little discussion about what we can do to change things. I just want to pull up a couple people from here in the ward who are experiencing the fights in these schools to say a couple words about what they're facing. So Mr. Gowder, if you don't mind coming up. Mr. Gowder.